All right, good afternoon, aloha, and thank you for being here. Just to let you know before we get started, some housekeeping items. We have some snacks, water, coffee, and tea in the back, and some lovely, delectable desserts, thanks to Evelyn Kaya. Thank you, Evelyn. So please help yourself. We do have 3 restrooms in the back, so if you need them, they are right back there. My name is Deidre Teagarden. I am the Executive Director for the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, and on behalf of our Board of Directors and all of our volunteers, we want to welcome you and thank you for being with us today at our second speaker series. So we are doing this because this is the 75th anniversary, as many of you know, of the formation of the 100th Battalion. And in honor of those men, their sacrifices of their families as well, we really wanted to do a lot in June to thank them for all that they did. Today we are thrilled to have Michael Markrich with us. For those of you who have not heard him speak, you are in for a treat. Whether you are a World War II buff, a history buff, or just a lover of humanitarian stories, you're very much going to enjoy what Michael has to say. So he came over here from Honolulu to be with us today, and I had the pleasure of listening to him at our earlier function, which was for the men of the 100th and their families, and so I know you'll enjoy it as well. After the speaker series is done today, we will be opening our education center downstairs, which I think most all of you have been to before. So you'll be able to see the premiere of the 100th Battalion, One Puka Puka, the Purple Heart Battalion exhibit. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but we want to make sure that you all go downstairs. And today we made sure to turn the AC on at 9 o'clock in the morning at 68 degrees. So when you go down there today, it'll be nice and cool for you. You know, our ability to have speaker series and to have exhibits are thanks to so many, and it's thanks to financial contributions that we have received from many of you here in the audience. Of course, we couldn't do it without the families and the memorabilia that they have shared with us over the years. We have an extensive archives downstairs, and we feel it's our responsibility to perpetuate the legacy, the history, and the stories of these men. And we are able to do so thanks to the very kind financial contributions that we receive. And just to let you know that no contribution is too small and no contribution is too large. We thank you for both. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the people who have donated to this exhibit, starting with the County of Maui, Office of Economic Development. I think Tokie Ogawa was going to be here. She must be on her way. Alexander and Baldwin Foundation, the 100th Infantry Battalion Veterans Education Center in Honolulu. There's Tokie. The Club 100 Maui chapter. Maui Sons and Daughters of the Nisei Veterans. Mr. Leonard Oka back there. We couldn't do it without his team. Thank you. Say Design, Ko'oi Radio Group, Pacific Media Group, Hiroshi Arizumi, David and Judy Fukuda, Jill Leezumigala Ross and her sister Joan Leezumigala, Peggy Mizumoto and her cousin Kathy, who actually flew over from Los Angeles. They planned their whole vacation around this talk today. They had family in the 100th Battalion. And Richard and Judith Michaels. Additionally, I'd like to recognize Melanie Agrabante, Mark Antosh, Stephen Doy, Jane Hirata, Ramona Ho, Lloyd Kitaoka, Mary Lawrence, Michael Markrich, Susan Morishige, Harry Nakayama, Diane Orikasa, Yukile Sugimura, Timothy John Terry, and Kyle Watanabe. All of these people have done so much for our organization. Let's give them a round of applause. So with that, I would like to introduce David Fukuda. I think he is not a stranger to many of you, but for those who don't know him, David has served with the NVMC board for over 9 years. His father, Major Mitsuyoshi Fukuda, was an original member of the 100th Battalion, and he was the unit's only Nisei commanding soldier. David worked in business on Maui for 25 years before becoming a history and economics professor at Kinke Kaolike. And he wears many hats, Currently, he serves as our volunteer yardman and historian. So please help me welcome David Fukuda.
I do have one correction that Deidre gave in terms of the facilities. There are two bathrooms. The middle one is a shower, so don't use that one. Right? But we do have large bathrooms outside in the courtyard too. So please feel free to use those. Before I introduce Mike, I'd like to introduce someone helping Mike. He's an intern with us and a junior at Kamehameha Schools, working the projector there. His name is John Williamson. Mike, like all the other sons and daughters of the 100th, we got to meet because he called us. He was doing a lot of research on different people in the 100th and was doing a write-up on my father. Mike used to have a column in the Honolulu Advertiser, and then went on in many businesses. Now he's working with a private organization, but he's worked with UH and still has a lot of interest in the 100th history. You'll see it come out when he talks. It's a real pleasure to have him come to Maui and visit with us and tell us a story about what he's done. This is probably, if some of you have been familiar with his work, he did the editing of this book called Combat Chaplain. And his talk is based upon the combat chaplain, Israel Yost. So at this time, I'd like to introduce to you Mike Markrich.
Thank you very much for coming. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be on Maui and an honor to talk about the 100 Battalion. I recently had the opportunity to talk to a man who was describing to me what it was to be happy. And I thought I'd start this part of the talk with this because I think it's germane. He said, if you want to be happy for an hour, he said, go fishing. If you want to be happy for a day, take a nap. If you want to be happy for life, help someone else. And we look at the 100 Battalion and the contribution the 100 Battalion has made to our society here in Hawaii. We have to think of all the many ways these men have served us, not only as soldiers, but as citizens and as the organizers of this wonderful multi-generational facility. You know, coming from Honolulu, it's so extraordinary to see a facility like this where the older people are not segregated from the younger people, and because and the community is involved. There's a museum downstairs, and it was one of the things that motivated these men when they went to war was to come back and have a Club 100 and have some continuity for their sacrifice, to know that people would remember them, and to think that the ideals that they fought for are still relevant. And of course they are very much today. So let's go to the first slide, John. History is life's teacher, which is another way of saying that you should pay attention as you go through life, because if you don't, it might be bad for you. So, because oftentimes things have a way of reoccurring that you're not prepared for. Let's go to the next one. This is the story of Israel Yost. Israel Yost was probably one of the most unlikely people to have ever encountered a group of Japanese people from Hawaii. He was born in Pennsylvania, and until the age of 9, can we go to the next slide? He lived in a very conservative community of next to Mennonites and Amish. And I don't know if any of you have been to Pennsylvania, but anyway, this is a sort of a separate community, a separate worldview. The world can pass them by, but they still are happy with who they are. And anyway, he lived a very contented life. His father sold farm machinery, and then at the age of 9, a tragedy struck. His father stopped for gas. A drunk driver hit the car. His father was terribly hurt at that time in 1925. And of course, there were no ambulance and things. And, it was very traumatic for a 9-year-old. And at that moment, he said, "Okay, I'm going to do something in my life that's going to help people. I'm going to make a contribution. I'm going to become a minister." And of course, that was much more difficult at that time for him because his family didn't have any money. They didn't have assurance, and he couldn't get over the fact that this was real because he thought, "Oh my God, has my life changed so much? Is this just a dream? Is this really true?" So his family struggled through the Depression, and then in the small town in Pennsylvania where he lived, the Ku Klux Klan came and burned a cross, and he saw this racial hatred at a young age, and he was overwhelmed by it. He said, "Wow, he's just not prepared." So he had an issue, and that was because in this area of Pennsylvania, if you've ever been there, you'll see that it doesn't look at all like New England or Virginia. These are rolling green, lush meadows, beautiful barns, very groomed fields. It's very much more like Germany. There's the people there, they just carefully take care of the land, and the land is beautifully cultivated. And he spoke with a German accent because that was a lot of people, they had all that Pennsylvania Dutch, a very strong kind of accent. So when he decided to go to college, and he did that the hard way. Of course, he waited tables and he worked construction, and he went to this Lutheran seminary, but he was always speaking with a Pennsylvania Dutch accent, which always made him seem like a hick. It always made him seem like an outsider. And for much of his life, he was very conscious of being an outsider, of not being considered a cultured, educated person. So his life goes forward. He's ready to get married. Just before he's engaged. Just before he's ready to get married, his wife, or his fiance, leaves him for someone else. And this is like another humongous blow. It's like, wow, he did everything right. He got his degree, and now the woman he loves leaves him. And so he meets someone else, decides to get married, decides to become a pastor, and do all the right thing. And still, he's trying, but he's in this little church, and the world is going by, this war going on. He's 27 years old. He doesn't have to go. But he does. He feels like he has to go. He has to do something. He has to be part of this world that's going around him. He has to see if maybe he can make a contribution in his life. So let's go on to the next slide. He joins the Pennsylvania National Guard. He goes through this Harvard program for producing chaplains, and through a series of accidents, he ends up at the 100 Battalion. He's actually supposed to be with a Pennsylvania unit, and then they tell him, no, you're assigned to those guys over there. He comes out of his Jeep, and he sees he's surrounded by Japanese people. And the colonel who's in charge, Colonel Ferrant Turner, says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm your new chaplain. My name is Israel Yost." And the colonel says, "Are you Jewish?" And he says, "Well, no, I'm Lutheran. Why do you ask that?" And he says, "Well, because your name is Israel. We're almost all Japanese, and this is the army." So he's this kind of tall, gangly guy, and he's always lived, because of his upbringing, he's intensely aware of always trying to do the right thing. And the first person he meets, other than the colonel, is this other older person named Katsumi Komitani, who's also in the battalion, who's actually 35 and is older than he is. And Katsumi Komitani is this very interesting guy who is a dentist in Honolulu. He's a sports promoter. He's a baseball enthusiast. He runs a minor league team. He's a gambler and a drinker. And they're assigned together. And so these are two all kinds of worlds that are all of a sudden thrown at Israel Yost. And he's as the war begins, he's awkward. He's like dropping things when everybody's supposed to be quiet when they're marching, and he gets a motorcycle, and the colonel comes out of this busy meeting and tells him to stop because he has to get rid of the motorcycle right away. And he said, "Well, why do you want me to get rid of the motorcycle?" He said, "Well, I'm not worried about the motorcycle. If you die as a chaplain, we'll never get another one." I was like, "Oh, okay." So then the war starts, and there's 6 companies in the 100 Battalion, each with 187 men. Each is commanded by a captain. Each is like a small community. He goes to each company and meets the soldiers, introduces himself, and asks if they need anything and what they would like him to do. And at first, he holds like a Lutheran sermon, and he only gets about 3 people because not many people know about Lutheranism. Who knows Lutheranism in Hawaii, right? There's the Anglicans, there's the Church of Christ, there's Catholics, and even there are not very many. I think 80 or 90% Buddhist in this in the 100 Battalion. So he tries his best, and he little by little he starts doing the things he's supposed to do. He follows the litter bearers to help with the wounded. He helps the medics at the aid station. He collects the dead from the battlefield after combat. This is because the soldiers all know each other, and seeing their relatives on the battlefield, and many people in the 100 Battalion are like cousins or family members or in-laws, brothers. It's so hard for them when they start losing people that if they should see them, it's even more traumatic than what they're experiencing. And when soldiers died, he wrote letters home. He does all those things. And now, one of the things that happens is that let's go forward, is that the 100 Battalion is, unbeknownst to him and everybody else in the 100 Battalion, they're about to step into some of the worst combat in the European theater in World War II. And that is because Winston Churchill has decided that, and President Roosevelt has agreed with him, that they are going to attack Italy. And they are going to attack Italy because it's the soft underbelly of Europe. And there's also something else, and that is, if they attack Italy, they're planning at the same time to invade France. What they want to do is they want to draw those German infantry divisions away from Russia and from Western Europe, so there'll be less of them going to France. But of course, what that means is you're going to be drawing fire from some of the best soldiers in the world, people who've been doing this since the age of 6, people who hate you. And you're just a person who's just signed on. You were a civilian 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago. In the case of the 100 Battalion, many of them had training for a year. But very few people are prepared for what they're to find. And so the Germans, there's another factor into this, and this is that initially the Americans thought when they invade Italy that the Italian government is going to fall and they're going to surrender, and that's going to be it. It's not going to be difficult. The Germans will just withdraw. But Adolf Hitler says no. Adolf Hitler says no, we're going to defend this, and I'm going to be micromanaging this almost every battle. And that is actually what happens. And he tells the people that the Germans there are to die before they give up any ground. So they land at Salerno, which is a terrible battle. Well, actually, they land after the battle, but that's, and they move up towards Cassino, up across the Volturno River. And every step of this journey, the Germans have the Germans have mined, the Germans have put in gun emplacements, the Germans have machine gun nests, the Germans have all of these things. And let's go on to the next slide. So these are, of course, 100 Infantry Battalion, what they look like. This is General Mark Clark, and he was tall, but you can see the relative height of the soldiers and General Mark Clark. So let's go on to the next one. This is Yost with Katsumi Komitani. See, they couldn't have been more different-looking people. You know, I think even to share a tent at first might have been difficult. But they became very good friends, and Komitani, as was 35, and he was a baseball coach, baseball. He was the guy who promoted baseball teams. He was really one of the few people in pre-war, few Japanese people in pre-war Honolulu who sort of had means to be a sports promoter. And when he saw all of his young baseball players going to war, he knew what was in store for them, and he really felt that he had to be there for them, because many of these people hadn't had any experience on the mainland. His experience was different. He got a swimming scholarship as a young man and worked all kinds of jobs in the mainland before he became a dentist. But he knew that many of these young people would be completely unprepared. Oh, okay. Let's go on to the next slide. This is one of the medical tents that at the 100 Battalion at that time, it would take maybe 15 or 20 hours after somebody was shot before they could evacuate them, because you would be put on the back of a jeep and you'd be carried out, and you lived or you died. And what Yost's role was to be there with the doctors and be there with these young people, and also Komitani, and to talk to these young men and encourage them, because it was all so painful, so traumatic, so quick. And let's go on to the next slide. And this is, of course, one of his jobs too. He had to he was like to be in charge of the graves, and the last thing he ever wanted to be was an undertaker. But they made him a graves registration officer in addition to being a chaplain, simply because they didn't have enough people. So let's go on to the next slide. And this was the 100 Battalion in combat. And what the 100 Battalion had that maybe other groups didn't have was they might have been small and diminutive, but they were really smart, and they were really brave, and they had that Japanese sense of honor or duty, that they would, no matter what happened, they would not let their family down. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, in order to understand what happened next, you have to really understand the origins of the war. And when the war begins, Nazism has taken power in Germany. It's had a youth movement already for 10 years. Young people in Germany from an early age are indoctrinated to hate, to train, to feel they're superior, to believe that by killing others they will make a better world, and that they are prepared to die for it. Let's go on. So this is the Hitler Youth training, and let's go on to the next. And so he's skilled. So what you have to know is at the time the war broke out, the Germans had 105 divisions. Each division has between 10,000 and 20,000 men. Okay. Anybody have an idea of how many divisions the United States had at that time? We had 5. Okay. So they had to invent an army immediately, and they had to do this in such a way to make people want to join the army, to trust their officers, to be good soldiers, and not be afraid from what's going to happen next. And it's the next one. And so these are training, and So these Germans were all professionals. The Germans, they didn't even believe in up through the ranks. People were trained to be leaders. They were trained to be officers. A colonel was 39 years old. In an American army, a general might be 56 years old, or a general might be, or a colonel might be 45 years old, as in the case of Ferrant Turner. Let's go on to the next one. And so then these are the skilled German soldiers. So these are the ruthless killers that the 100 Battalion faces. And not only do they face these people, but these people have combat experience already for 2 or 3 years. So they know exactly what transpires on a battlefield, and they know tactics, and they know, if they do X, Y will probably happen, and that's where they can direct their fire. And the Americans begin taking tremendous casualties. And the Americans start having all these problems in Italy. Large numbers of Americans desert. There's large numbers of people have shell shock and trauma. There's all of these different things. And the Americans' equipment is not as good as the German equipment. The Americans find out that the American tanks, the soldiers called them Ronsons, because they were like Ronson lighters. Because one shot and they would go up, and they were against these German Panzer tanks. So 100 Battalion immediately goes into battle with Israel Yost, and this is what they're facing. And they start. Almost everybody is really unprepared for this, but let's go to the next slide. So what I was saying was that 100 Battalion, what made that different from other units, comparable units in the United States Army, was the intelligence level, the training, and the endurance. When the 100 Battalion is formed, it's taken from maybe the best baseball players in the Japanese-American community in Honolulu, the top scoring students, sort of the cream of the crop of young men, plus the people in the National Guard, and some of whom were actually not even Japanese, but who wanted to go. And then the people who were in the National Guard and people who joined the National Guard before World War II did that because times were hard in Hawaii. The depression was that affected the mainland, also affected the local community here, and people wanted to join the National Guard for the extra income, the same reason they do today. But a lot of the people who worked on plantations, they were used to being in a very rough environment and outside, working long hours. So, and they had fairly low expectations as opposed to maybe white Americans who had signed up but who had no idea how grueling this could be. So 100 Battalion goes off. Nobody knows what to do with them. So at first nobody can trust them because they're Japanese, and the different generals in the army keep turning them down. And Ferrant Turner, who is a person who works with sugar plantation companies and whose family was Anglican ministers earlier, he's a big believer in them, and he's always lobbying for them. And so finally, he gets them to go to North Africa, and then they're going to put them in some sort of a secondary role. And he says, no, I want them to be infantry. That's what they're trained for. They should have the same right to be in danger as anyone else. But even he had no expectation of what they were going to face. So let's go on to the next one. So who are the officers in this? There's Ferrant Turner. There's Major Jim Lovell. He's a PE teacher at McKinley High School. Jack Johnson is a captain. He's a former football star from the University of Hawaii. Jack Mizuha is a local, he's one of the few officers who's Japanese. He's from Maui, and he's a teacher. And the fighting begins, and at first, Israel Yost isn't sure. Once the fighting begins, he follows them. Like as I said, he follows them to the aid station, but it's really very, very difficult doing that. And the worst part, of course, is, that you're with somebody one day, and the very next day something has happened and they've died tragically. And one day he's told, for example, he has a sergeant that he works with, and he's told to go recover some bodies, and he starts calling for the sergeant, and they recover the bodies, and he's so upset when he comes home. He says, where is Sergeant so-and-so? He wasn't here today. I always expect him. And they say to him, that was him. That was the sergeant. You just put him in a body bag. And it's very, very hard to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, but because he has this strong belief in doing the right thing and always, trying to serve the community, he's able to continue. And as Christmas approaches, so I have to tell you that by the time they get to November, in fighting these battles, they've lost nearly all their top officers been wounded, and they've 78 dead, 250 wounded, and this is by November. So he joined them, at the end of September. So boom, this is all of a sudden this is all happening really, really fast. And Christmas time comes. They're finally after taking these horrendous casualties. And one of the things that the Japanese learned to do, the members of the 100 learned to do, is that the Germans have everything zeroed in during the day, so they can't move during the day. And the Germans have all the high ground. But little by little, the soldiers of the hundreds learn all the quirks of the way the Germans think, and they're very repetitious. They're very predictable. They always do X and Y will happen. Well, once you figure out, you can do Z. Once you can do something else. And they started going at night. They started using different kinds of their own tactics, and that enabled them to survive. So Christmas comes around, and by this time, he's been doing all this, and he's gotten to know the local families because he's writing to them when their sons died or are wounded, or sometimes the sons can't write. And he's holding the services, and actually people are coming now, not because they're Lutherans, but because, he's able to provide some sort of comfort, and they now accept him and believe in him. And sometimes when things are really, really bad and no one has, the morale's really down, he's known for playing a harmonica. He does that. He'll just play music. And so he can kind of make these contributions that are cross-cultural. And he tries to do everything the Army wants him to do. And he has this book, and he tries to follow it the way he always tried to do, because he's really earnest. And then it's Christmas. And it's Christmas Eve, and he gets ready to write his sermon. And even though he's not expecting a lot of people to come, because not everybody celebrates Christmas, he's going to write his Christmas sermon. And he's ordered at that very moment to go gather bodies. And he tells the officer, "No, I'm not going to do that. That's ridiculous. That's you can't ask me to do that. It's I'm the chaplain, and this is my job, and I have to do this for the men." And there's silence. And then he thinks, "Oh no." He goes back to his tent, and he starts thinking, "Wow, this is the end of my career." You say this to a superior officer in the Army, that's what happens. And a few moments later, to his surprise, he hears all these trucks taking off. The people are starting the trucks that he was to go in with to recover the bodies, and they're driving off. And he runs out, and he says, where are you going? And they said, "Well, you're needed, at the administrative headquarters. That's where you're supposed to go." And he goes, "Oh boy, this is it. I'm done for. Everything I've worked for is going to be gone. I'm going to go home a disgrace to Pennsylvania." And instead, the captain there, who's a local man, hands him his new orders, and the orders are for rest and recreation in Naples. And he said, well, I didn't apply for rest and recreation. He says, no, there's been a change in the orders. These are your new orders. Go away for 5 days. So he did, and that was it. The 100 Battalion, he thought, wow, these people, they cared enough to cover for me, to save me, and that made a huge impression on him. And later on, he is with Katsumi Komitani, and you have to remember at this time the horrible things that are happening when they're trying to take Cassino, and the American army is pushing and pushing and pushing, and they're pushing soldiers, many of whom have very little training, to go up against German guns and mines, and they're dying in large numbers. On January 20th, on one of the rivers leading to Cassino, the 36th Division from Texas is cut in half. Half of them die. It's just horrible. And then after that happens, because the Germans have this all mined, and they have everything all worked out where the people are going to be, and then 4 days later, it's the 100th turn, and the 100th are sent across a river similarly, and they take tremendous casualties. And during this time, by tremendous casualties, I mean almost everyone who goes across is killed or wounded, seriously wounded. And as he and Komitani are watching the soldiers, they see one of the soldiers coming back. He's coming back. He's walking back towards them. And Yost, who has this by-the-book mentality, says, wow, are we going to report him? He's deserting. And Komitani said, no, we're not going to do anything. He's going to be reassigned. He's given all he has to give. And so then Yost thought about that. He said, well, that was the way that the people of Hawaii thought, that they took care of themselves. They took care of each other. That was something that made them different. By the beginning of February, this battle is so fierce. 55,000 people will die in this battle. 20,000 people die, 55,000 casualties. The 100, which starts with 1,300 men, by February is down to 582. So it's like, wow, all this has happened. So let's go on forward. This is crossing the Rapido River. We can go through these sort of things about the war. And this is the Battle of Monte Cassino. You've probably heard about this. This is Anzio. General Mark Clark, who was in charge of the Fifth Army, wanted to put the soldiers across at the Rapido River as a diversion for the attack on Anzio, which also went very badly. But eventually, the Americans were able to win, but at tremendous cost. So let's go on. And this is something. This is France, but we're not going to go into talk about France. Let's go to the next one. And they later on, 100 Battalion will join the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and all of a sudden there'll be two Japanese chaplains in addition to Yost. And of course, Yost has been thinking, well, what do they need me for? They're going to have Japanese chaplains, but they did. They wanted him to stay. Let's go on to the next one. And this is Willie Gu, who was just here, and Willie was one of the soldiers that knew Chaplain Yost, and Willie grew up on Maui, and what was interesting was that when he was growing up, his father was Chinese, his mother was Japanese, and he would eventually marry a lady who was Japanese, and he was one of those sort of the Hapa soldiers. Not everybody who was in the 100 Battalion, was Japanese. And this was one of the things that Yost learned, was that people, the 100 Battalion soldiers were flexible about a lot of things, but when it came to food, they weren't. They, they had to have rice, and they had to have certain kinds of things. And one of the other things he learned was never to ask where the food came from. And that might have been one of the only fortunate things about being in the front, was that maybe they had first contact with all the farms. But I asked Willie, when I was doing an article about him, I asked him about the different ethnicities of the people who were in the 100 Battalion. And he said, basically, you know, we didn't care about ethnicity. We didn't ask, are you this, are you that? He said, we were there to serve our country, to fight for a better America. Let's go on to the next one. This is Takashi Kitaoka. Takashi Kitaoka also knew Israel Yost, and Takashi was a very remarkable man. He died recently at age 104. Now, Takashi always wanted to be an attorney. He grew up on Maui, and he went to University of Oklahoma Law School before World War II, came back to Hawaii. Because the law in Hawaii was so different, he failed the bar, and that was a calamity for him, because everybody expected him to pass the bar, and the whole family invested in him to go to law school and everything. And anyway, he was thinking that things couldn't get much worse, and then boom, Pearl Harbor came. He's drafted, and all of a sudden, he's one of those selected for the 100. He becomes a sergeant, and he has this tremendously difficult war, but somehow he comes through it without being hurt. And he told me that when he came back from the war, I said, you know, what did you do? He said, well, I immediately took the bar. I said, well, how'd you do? He said, I failed it. I said, well, what did you do then? He said, well, I took it again. And I said, well, and then how could you keep going with all this that was happening to you? And then what he did, and at the time he was 100 years old, he quoted the full speech of Polonius, "To thine own self be true," and he did it verbatim. I was going, wow, what a mind. Anyway, he becomes a prominent judge here in Hawaii. So he was one of these people also who was very much thinking, I'm going to come back to Hawaii and things are going to be different. Let's go on to the next one. This is Stanley Leezumigala. He has a very interesting story in the 100 Battalion archives about being a soldier and surviving, and about learning all those things you had to learn. Sometimes it was just blind luck, but after a while it was just, you know, being able to, the German machine guns were different than American machine guns, the rifles were different, the tactics were different, probably even the smell of the people were different, and just learning how to survive in this completely dangerous, crazy, violent experience he was thrust into. And let's go on to the next one. This is Jack Mizuha. Jack, with Takashi Kitaoka's one of his best friends, he also wanted to be an attorney. He becomes eventually a Supreme Court justice in Hawaii. But anyway, he is the person when Israel Yost comes to the 100 Battalion and holds the first memorial service. The first thing Jack Mizuha says to him is, we don't really believe what you believe, but go ahead. You know? So Jack, he is badly wounded, and he ends up in a hospital, and he's so upset about things, the internment things are happening to the Japanese. And the fact that, you know, that yes, there are some advocates for the Japanese, but the Democrats are not responding. Eleanor Roosevelt is, you know, saying all these good things about, you know, justice for all and helping people and everything. Nobody's really helping them. He writes to her from his hospital bed. Of course, he doesn't get an answer. You know, anyway, eventually he gets an answer, and the answer is, you know, thank you very much. This is not really what I do. Da 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 da. He writes her again. He says, well, maybe it should be. He gets some response back, and she does it. she actually becomes an advocate for Japanese American soldiers against internment. And interestingly enough, one of the, my friend, Dr. Otagaki, who also knew Jack Mizuha, was when he was at, he was badly, he was a triple amputee, and when he was at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., Eleanor Roosevelt sent a car, invited him to lunch, and asked him to come to the White House for lunch. And I wouldn't be surprised if this happened after this. So let's go on. One of the things about Jack was that, like many of the people in the 100 Battalion, they had lived through the worst. So when they came back to Hawaii, they were determined that things were going to be different, things were going to be better. Let's go to the next one. This is Jesse Oba. Jesse Oba was a part Native Hawaiian, part Japanese soldier. There were a number of these. And one of the families I spoke to was telling me about how much of the family was Japanese, but during the war, they took a Hawaiian name because they were afraid their land might get confiscated. They might be interned. Let's go on to the next one. So this is Israel Yost. In 1947, Israel Yost comes back. He brings the bodies back. People, you know, I told you he was worried about the other Japanese chaplains, whether or not they would want him or not, because he wasn't Japanese. But they asked him, invited him, paid for him to come from Pennsylvania when the bodies were repatriated from Europe. And here's it, the next one. And then he met with the mothers, and he knew the mothers, and they knew him. And these are actually very touching photos of he and them, their height, so it's very different, but that quality of heart they had together, they shared. And let's go to the next one. And this is maybe my favorite photograph of this series. Let's go to the next one. And this is him on Maui in 1947. And let's go to the next one. So Israel Yost had found his community in a way. He had found friendship and he'd found belonging in the most unexpected place. And that would change his life forever. He went back at the end of the war to his wife, and first he had a series of small Lutheran churches, and he had a larger one. And he was almost always in trouble because he was an early advocate for civil rights. When a Japanese family moved into the area of Pennsylvania and nobody wanted to let them live in the neighborhood, he insisted. And anyway, I think what happened was that that was one of the reasons he might have lost that particular parish, because and so he went from parish to parish, and he ends up as a prison minister, always looking for a way to be useful, always looking for a way to be helpful. But the war never left him. In 1960, he calls up Katsumi Komitani, and this was after he lost his job in the one parish. He says, "I want to come to Hawaii." And Katsumi says, "No. What do you want to come to Hawaii for?" He says, "No, I want to come and I want to be in Hawaii. I want to move my family." And Katsumi says, "Well, you have 11 children." and he says, I really want to come. And then there's a silence, and Katsumi says, "Well, I guess 13 more people won't sink this rock." So at the end, these people in the 100, they really couldn't say no to each other. And he comes and with his family, and they live for 2 years, and they live in the Club 100 apartments, and then he founds a church, which is still in existence, in Waianae. At the end of his life, he was thinking about this almost every day, and his wife told me that sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night crying for a medic, yelling for a medic to help somebody. So when I think of all of these people that I mentioned, I think of not just great Americans, but great human beings, great people who made this world a better place. And it's an honor to write about them, and it's an honor to tell their story. And I want to thank you all for inviting me today.
we're not going to let you go so easily.
Okay.
We want to thank you so much for sharing those stories, and we want to see if there are any questions that people might in the audience that might have for you. Any questions? Yes, Dr. Galpin.
Mark, right at the start you said that he went to Harvard for chaplaincy training before he joined the 100. So was he already ordained?
He was ordained.
Oh, okay.
So what they did was they had this sort of Harvard Divinity School had this special program for mass-producing chaplains. Chaplains, incidentally, had one of the highest rates of fatality in World War II of any group of people. Yes?
When they came back home, would they parlare Italiano?
Well, you know, a lot of them married Italian girls. They led that. You know, they did. That was the thing. That was one of the things that he had to do. Was, you know, he would be writing that letter explaining why the son was going to marry this Italian girl that he had met in Europe. You know, the family was writing back, what? You know, that was one of the things that happened. But those are many happy marriages.
So Chaplain Yost was assigned to the 100th, and then when they merged with the 442nd, he was a part of that, or was he assigned to the 442nd? And then with whom did he muster out?
Well, he mustered out with the 100. I mean, it was 442nd 100-man. The 100 became absorbed into the 442nd, and so that was he was part of the 100 when he went out.
So that was in like 1945?
1945, and then they had a big parade, and then he told his wife he wasn't going. That was the one where you know all the newsreels were there, and President Truman, and they were going to give them all medals, and he said, "That's it. I don't want anything more to do with the army. I don't want anything more to do with war. I've had it." And that was, and he did. He didn't. From that point on, he devoted himself to thinking that people could be made better, which is a difficult task. Not one that's always rewarding. Not always rewarded, but I guess can be rewarding. I'm sorry. Anybody else have a question? No?
Yeah, over to your left. Jack.
Yeah, so the question regarding the assault on Monte Cassino, there was initially you mentioned the battalion, basically of Texas.
The 36th Division.
And that they were in such a bad way, I think they had a title called the Lost Battalion, and that then there was a decision made to go and rescue them. I don't know if that's quite correct.
Those are different stories. The Battle of the Lost Battalion involved people from the 36th Division, but that was in the Vosges Mountains. That was the part we didn't go through. The 36th Division that went across the river at Cassino, they lost half their number. And at the end of the war, the senators and congressmen from Texas asked Congress to investigate Mark Clark for killing so many young men from Texas and throwing them in what were basically World War I style tactics, where they just threw people against machine guns, and they were so mad. And then Mark Clark wrote this book called Calculated Risk, where this was a thing that Mark Clark was the person who was in charge of much of these battles, but for the rest of his life, he had to justify himself because so many people were angry at him for making these decisions.
Did he and his family remain in Hawaii?
They stayed only 2 years in Hawaii, and then they went back, he died some years ago, and his family lives mainly in Maryland, all in the same area, and they all have sort of memories of Hawaii. One of his sons is a very well-known sculptor. None of them are ministers.
He said he had 11 children?
11 children. Actually, there was a photo I was shown by the eldest daughter, and it was taken in Hawaii of all the parents, and Israel was the tallest, and then each of their children all the way down. Israel Yost was certainly a remarkable man.
I have a question. There was the poem that was written, "Step Off the Road to Let the Dead Pass By."
Yes.
And it's such a moving poem, but I wondered if you could give us some background information on where that came from. I don't know if it's in your book, but
It is in the book.
Is it?
In the book, and that's a story that I should have told. There was a Jack Johnson, whom I mentioned, who was the football star at the time at the University of Hawaii. Everybody knew his name. He was a genuine aristocrat, and he was in the National Guard. He worked for a shirt company on Kauai. All the soldiers just thought he was great, and Yost thought that was the ideal person was Jack Johnson. If there was anybody, if Israel Yost could have been born again, maybe if it would have been as Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson had this incredibly beautiful wife who was a Robinson from Niihau. He had this kind of fantasy life. Anyway, at one of the battles at the Rapido River, in the middle of the night, Jack Johnson steps on a mine, and so they're supposed to send out 2 people to bring him in, and Yost goes looking for him because Yost hears that he's been hurt, because Yost is on the battlefield finding out what's happening, and he hears that Jack Johnson is hurt, and he goes searching everywhere, and there's no truck. There's no truck to bring him in, and so he doesn't understand why there can't be some vehicle to bring him in. Why can't they bring him in? And so he spends all this time searching in the dark for a truck, trying to get a truck desperately, and despite all of his efforts, Jack Johnson dies. And so Jack Johnson was one of those unique people in Hawaii's history who, have the admiration, love, and affection of people from all different ethnicities and walks of life, and so in order to tell the story of the tragedy of Jack Johnson, he wrote that poem about Walk By, and basically what happened was that one day he was with a group of litter bearers, and they were carrying a young Japanese member of the 100 that had been killed in battle. And this was during some of the worst period that they were hearing about, this internment and things that were happening. And all of a sudden, one by one, white soldiers stopped and started saluting. And it was like, wow. They had earned their place in America. They'd earned their place in the world. And that was, maybe one of those meaningful things. Should I read it? When soulless men our high ideals defy, when our fond hopes and visions start to die, when selfishness engulfs, let's you and I step off the road to let the dead pass by. When human wrongs for right to heaven cry, if for ideals you may have to die, to keep your aims in life clear-cut and high, step off the road to let the dead pass by. So I think that's a good place to end. Yeah. Did you have a question? University of Hawaii Press. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause to Michael Markrich. So all of the stories and many of the gentlemen that Mike had referred to in his talk, we do have the exhibit downstairs. And I think as you go through the exhibit, you'll see many familiar names now and have a little bit more in-depth information on, for instance, the Battle of Monte Cassino. So we encourage all of you to go down. The exhibit room is open now. You can take your time and leisurely go down. We'll be open for the rest of the afternoon. I'd like to call up David to close out this afternoon, but again, I just wanted to thank you all for being here, and thank you so much to Mike Markrich for spending his time with us today, and I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you. This is the 75th anniversary from the founding of the 100th Infantry Battalion. And this is the reason why we're putting together an exhibit. It'll come in two parts. Today you will look at the formation of the 100th Infantry Battalion, their training in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. They went down to Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and then went over to Iran, where they got their orders to go to Italy and fought in Italy. And you'll follow them from Salerno up through Monte Cassino, and we end there in this phase. In August, we will have the second phase, and that'll take them from Anzio up through Rome and up to Leghorn or Livorno. And at that point, they lose their designation 100th Infantry Battalion as separate and become fully part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. So next year, on the 75th anniversary of the 442nd, we will then take the units up to France, and we'll talk about that Lost Battalion battle there, and then them coming back to Italy and making that final push to the Gothic line to the end of the war. So I hope you follow us through this entire adventure. Melanie Agriganti is down there. She's the one that has been putting together all the posters that we have, trying to put this picture together for you. Hope you enjoy it, and please, if you can get to there today or want to see it again, bring other people along with you. Thank you very much for coming.